I'm Michelle from Studio Noel, and today I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Joel Strohmeier from Nomensa. And he is an accessibility specialist with a background in digital design and experience, which spans over 14 years. So, hi, Joel.
Hello.
Fantastic. So we've got some questions today which run through about accessibility. So I'd really love to understand your perspective on it. So why did you get into the field of accessibility, and what has been the driving force behind focusing on that area?
Yeah, I suppose it was a gradual development. So I started in a digital corporate communications world. So this was just after I'd graduated from university. I was initially considering trying to move into the world of advertising. So I applied for a few different graduate schemes at different advertising companies, and seemed to get good feedback from the different agencies. But one of the overwhelming bits of the responses from the people interviewing me was that they thought that I might get bored in the type of role that I was applying to, which was
Oh,
hard to
wow.
hear at the time. But on reflection, probably was correct, really. What I hadn't realized is that certainly back then, I don't know if that's the case now, but it was quite hard to enter into the world of advertising through graduate schemes without going into the sort of account management or account executive side of things. So for
Yeah.
those who aren't aware, that's where you are kind of you're, I guess, the voice of your client within the advertising agency, and there's lots of kind of admin and organization and all sorts of different skills. But I must have been giving off the impression that that wasn't the right kind of role for me, and so I found that I was applying to lots of different advertising companies, but not getting very far, basically.
Mhm.
But in the end, I managed to make some more progress, speaking with an organization that specialized in um, digital communications for FTSE 100 companies, basically. So I was brought into an account exec role at a company called The Group. And they, as I say, yeah, they specialized in corporate communications. But what I found is that speaking with some of the different people in specific disciplines gave me a really I was kind of introduced to these really interesting ideas of things like information architecture. It's kind of the
Mhm.
first time I'd heard that word from some of the consultants within that organization. But also this word of accessibility as well, primarily through speaking with developers. And once I'd started to read a little bit more about those topics, I found that I was really fascinated with them. And then over the years, I've done various different roles in digital teams. So I've done a little bit of work in search engine optimization and content editing, and
Mhm.
supporting the creation of landing pages on web pages for advertising campaigns across the financial services sector and energy sector. And all throughout my time, continued to I continue to find this idea of building things that are accessible and usable and robust
Yeah.
really interesting. So I spent a lot of time in evenings and weekends teaching myself about development and design through that accessibility lens. I guess I don't necessarily have a sort of strong connection to accessibility other than finding it fascinating and wanting to do a better job, really. But I suppose speaking with my dad over the years, I found that he certainly struggled with technology and websites, and
Mhm.
that was always something that I was acutely aware of. I guess that it's easy when you're in the world of design and development to
Yeah, definitely.
think that everyone finds things easy, or you can come in with the biases, basically. So yeah, I guess I have a small view to the power of accessibility through some people in my family, I guess.
Yeah, I think it really helps and gives like a really interesting lens as well, doesn't it? When you've got another understanding from it, so that's fantastic. And what has been like an exciting project in this field that you've worked on for you?
Um, Lots, I suppose, lots really.
Mm.
The one that springs to mind that I talk about a lot, I guess, probably bore people with, is the test and trace program. So
Yeah.
I was I've been at the agency that I'm at now, Nomensa, for I think around 2 years, and my
Hmm.
line manager mentioned that we were going to be working with. Well, we had been brought in to support the accessibility and inclusion aspects of that test and trace program, um,
Fantastic.
as well as user research as well. But my bit was the accessibility and inclusion side of things. So I was sort of seconded to that program of work for about a year, I think, in total.
Hmm.
And it was, as you can imagine, it was very high profile,
Yeah.
quite high pressure, as you would imagine, but also an extraordinary sort of challenge that you may only face something like that once in your life, really, in the sense that it was such a big, complicated program. I think there were maybe 700 people as part of the kind of user experience or
Wow.
customer experience team. I think it was, so it's a big group of us across
Hmm.
various different agencies that I was collaborating with and different departments. So I would work with, I think it's NHS Digital,
Hmm.
different departments within UK HSA, as it's now known. So that's United Kingdom Health Security Agency, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And then, yeah, various other agencies like, Deloitte, KPMG, you name it.
Hmm.
Basically, there were Hippo, all
Wow.
sorts of different, or, other agencies.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was a real challenge because I basically sort of came in and quickly was asked to establish the governance and the processes. So
Hmm.
people didn't really know where to begin. And I think I was lucky that I had really excellent training from my colleagues at Nomensa, so kind of knew how a process could work and how we could
Yeah.
start to help the rest of the organization understand how you go from let's say in a lot of cases an already built live website to
Hmm.
identifying all the accessibility barriers and fixing them, managing expectations around what that takes.
Yeah.
The other thing with test and trace, which is really interesting, is which I've mentioned in another webinar that I did, is that theoretically, because this was a series of public sector services, theoretically the toolkit, standards, and governance already existed because the government
Hmm.
digital service had created all of these tools and all of this
Yeah.
kind of resources. But I don't think that people either knew or had given much attention to it. So most
Hmm.
rules that theoretically should have been applied weren't. So half my time was doing a bit of a roadshow and explaining to people that these standards exist, they're
Yeah.
documented, there is a process for testing and reaching these standards, but just helping people to navigate it really. So I mean, half the
Yeah.
time I was just basically pasting URLs to specific bits of the online documentation, but apparently that was useful, a useful role.
That sounds brilliant. How that must have been quite tricky then, especially navigating so many different organizations through that journey as well, and
Yeah, I mean,
working out how you can collaborate together.
definitely.
Mm,
As with anything, lots of the teams were really keen to do a good job. I think
yeah.
that's been my experience with lots of the clients who come to Nomensa, for example, that I've worked
Mm,
with. I know I've been lucky that most of the time people really care about accessibility or they want to do a good job.
yeah.
Not many people that you meet are proactively trying to build a bad product or service. But it's helping the teams to understand that. I mean, a lot of the time, I think I've said this, in interviews before, but it's
Mm,
still human nature for a lot of people is if you do a visual analysis of something or a visual appraisal of a web page,
mm,
that's still how a lot of us are taught. The end that you can end your analysis at the point of looking at something.
yeah.
I still think that's quite commonplace, and a big part of my job is to show people that there are all sorts of different ways that you can assess quality, and
Yeah.
that visual assessment is not is not good enough. And with test and trace, actually, that's one of the things I found is that what a lot of the organizations we were working with, the development teams across these different
Mm,
agencies, they'd make something look like public sector. So it would look
yeah.
governmenty or NHS like, but it didn't
Hmm.
have any of the stuff going on behind the scenes that guarantees that, for example,
Mm.
someone who's using a keyboard alone or
So the more technical setup,
screen.
yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So that was one of the things I had to explain to people as well. So if you're not testing it, then you can't have any
Yeah.
guarantee that it's going to work, essentially.
It's interesting. And I think as also with testing, how do you find that aspect of like plugins and tools where people talk a lot of the time versus that manual check as well, which often I feel like is sometimes missed, where I'm
Mm.
just like, you also have to manually do these things as well a lot of the time.
Yes, yes, that's it's yeah, it's a really interesting one as well because
Mm.
one of the first things that I think certainly there's a maturity aspect with anyone you're working with, whether that be sort of visual design maturity or
Mm.
the content design. There's all sorts of skills, I guess, that can take time
Yeah.
to build up, and that's certainly the case. We find that again, making a slight generalization, but organizations that are maybe slightly more newer to the accessibility understanding journey or earlier in their kind of
Hmm.
maturity, one of the questions we tend to get asked quite early on is, yeah, so which tools can we, it's
Yeah.
almost like which tools can we outsource this problem to?
Yes.
And I totally get it. We're all very
Yeah.
busy, so we want to understand what the shortcut is. But what I tend to do is I'll come back to tools that can speed things up for you. But we do, as you just pointed out, we
Hmm.
do try to explain to people that if you're asking which tools can take this off our plate really early, then you're not
Hmm.
seeing accessibility as a means to create a great. You're not seeing it as an
That's
opportunity to
it.
create a great experience, basically. So
Yeah, I
I
think
tend to
it's
kind of
interesting,
put that
isn't
on
it? It
ice.
almost needs to be the foundational principle as well, like not the afterthought, which I tend to find like when you mention like plugins as well, that
Yeah.
can be the tendency. Interesting that you've had similar experience then.
Yeah.
And how do you think accessibility can make positive impact on an organization's success?
Yeah,
What have you seen in the
it's a really,
past?
yeah, interesting sort of question that we're constantly asking ourselves and our
Yeah.
clients. Um, at the most basic level, the accessibility, like user experience or usability more specifically, I guess, it's all about making things simpler or easier.
Hmm.
So um, that's one of the things we try to explain. So I think when you're talking with an organization in those early conversations, yeah, often accessibility, perhaps maybe similar to security,
Hmm.
is seen as sort of like a risk or a problem to solve,
Hmm.
and can be spoken about like it's a sort of esoteric or sort of slightly unusual checkbox that organizations need to sort of maybe slightly begrudgingly need to tick off. So one of the key things we try to explain is that it's part of the overarching set of improvements that
Yeah.
will make your product easier for people to use, or if you remove barriers, that you will be able to increase satisfaction rates or completion rates of your
Mm.
checkout process, whatever it may be. So I think first thing is trying to encourage people to align accessibility with a broader sense of improving your product and making it easier.
Yeah.
Um, and then, of course, there is a commercial angle to that.
Hmm.
I've had these conversations before where there is a slight nervousness, maybe, or people are slightly maybe embarrassed to talk about the commercial arguments for accessibility. I
Yeah.
think because the ethical
Hmm.
argument is understandably a really important one. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes people in the accessibility community are concerned that if we start to talk about the commercial aspects, that could lead to some bad outcomes. And really, the ethical argument is the one we should focus on. And I totally understand that concern.
Yeah.
I
Same.
think it's in a commercial setting, when I'm talking to private sector organizations in particular,
Mm.
I think it is important that we explain that there is a commercial argument for
Yeah.
removing barriers as well.
I
So
completely agree. And I think often finding as well that there is that decision-making process as well about people investing in accessibility and somebody being able to sell that into somebody higher up in the business as well. There is that need sometimes for that, I suppose, that business angle on it and the return on investment that they need as well.
yeah.
Um, Okay, fantastic. And what would you say are the biggest challenges and misconceptions that you encounter when introducing accessibility to a client? And how do you go about approaching these or tackling
Yeah.
these? Where
There
to
are a
start?
few. Try not to sort of go on a
Yeah.
long sort of tirade, for want of a better term. But no, there are a few, and again, I think
Yeah.
it's that yeah, there are a few. So I guess one of the first ones. So I guess one of the ones that we hear, one of the misconceptions or myths we hear is that that we, insert organization here doesn't have many people with disabilities, or like that's not a concern of ours because we don't think that the people with disabilities are interacting with a product or service is one that I think we hear it less because I think there's probably been a bit more of an emphasis on accessibility in recent years. And so
Yeah.
I think perhaps there might still be people out there who believe that, but then perhaps they're not saying it as confidently as they were a few years ago. But I still think that's a challenge, and again, it's a challenge of human nature biases.
Yeah, definitely.
Basically. I think that's a particularly tricky one because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If that's your attitude, especially if you're in a kind of a position where you have influence, maybe you're senior leadership and you have that attitude, and even whether you're saying it or not, it's going to be obviously affecting the things you invest in your behavior.
Yeah.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy as well because you're not testing, you're not checking things, you're not doing user
Yeah.
research, and therefore the overwhelming likelihood is that you will have loads of barriers,
Yeah.
and people are
Yes.
going to be hitting the web page and then bouncing off,
Yeah.
or
Straight
abandoning.
away.
So that's why that one is particularly tricky because it will be true if that's what your attitude is, or it will likely become true. So that's a really important one that people need to realize, to stop thinking basically, and doing a small bit of research, they'll realize that that's obviously wildly inaccurate attitude. So that's one. As I say, I'm hearing it less, but I don't know if that means that the attitude has gone away. It might just be that people are
Yeah.
aware of what they're saying. I don't know. That may be me being
I
silly.
think it's interesting as well, like public sector versus private sector as well, and potentially like how people are looking at accessibility at that point. We notice it probably more, I would say, private sector potentially, but I don't know what your experience has been.
It really varies. I think more often we're finding that organizations will come to Nomensa having already put some of the groundwork in. So quite often we'll have a client contact, a single main client contact. That's the person who probably sends the request for proposal from us, or the initial brief. And generally they are either formally or often informally, I would say more commonly, they'll be informally the accessibility sort of champion, or they've taken that as their role, and they will have done some internal communications and PR exercise, or they come to us, which is, is really appreciated because it means we don't have to kind of always start completely from scratch. Sometimes we do, and that's fine, and that's part of our job. But it's nice when we already have one or two people who say that they understand the importance. They've done some presentation around the statistics around it, the benefits,
Brilliant.
and we can kind of come in at a certain level, which is nice.
Yeah, because there's already that education in there, which is fantastic. That's really helpful.
Yeah, and we can sort of then echo again quite often sometimes, as I say, we're starting from scratch and we're educating the client and we're taking them on that journey. But often a part of my role, I will admit it now, is kind of echoing what someone in that organization has been saying for a while. I'm aware that I'm not coming in saying stuff that's unique or like really like opening everyone's minds. It can simply be that it's an external voice that resonates.
Validates.
So that's
fantastic.
role as well.
Brilliant. The biggest misconceptions, were there any more which you wanted
Yes,
to
there are. So,
say?
yes, misconceptions. The other one is that quite often organizations or teams will think that the developers will kind of have all of that sorted. So I think, there's a sense that, well, if a developer works for X or Y agency, or designer is employed by insert agency here with a good reputation, let's say, or this developer is really good, if they're building really complicated things and they've always kind of delivered against the brief that has been given to them, again, maybe it's understandable that people think, well, I thought that you would. That's
It was
just
bound to be
day.
accessible.
Um,
Yeah.
it really isn't. This is something that I still find kind of surprising. Actually, is that it
Mm.
it doesn't matter how brilliant the developers are. There isn't really accessibility is not a core part of the development curriculum.
Yeah. I was
It
going to say, it does seem like
changed.
it's about like standard processes, isn't it? And it's not always the fact that it is the norm.
Mm,
And I think there is a potentially an expectation around that sometimes that people, oh, well, of course it's going to be accessible. Whereas I do think it sometimes, I don't know whether you find that comes down more to a briefing stage of, are we asking for that up front and being incredibly clear that this is what we expect?
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So
Mm.
I mean, I was reading a blog recently about the sort of life of a developer, and I think
Mm.
it's a tricky role as well. You have to know
Yeah.
so much, to in front end development, you need to know all sorts of, arguably you're going to be asked to know all sorts of different frameworks. There's
Yeah.
a new kind of flavor of front end development seemingly every month. So you have to be aware of all these different changes in the way that pages are put together. You have to be aware of
Mm.
things like performance, security. There are so many aspects of front end development that I have a huge amount of sort of admiration
Yeah.
really for the job. And
Mm.
I think sometimes developers can be like a bit of a scapegoat, frankly, in some
Oh,
cases.
yeah.
Um, so I think very often as well, incredibly time poor, as well.
Hmm.
You're constantly trying to play catch up, basically. So as you just
Yeah.
pointed out, if accessibility hasn't been defined clearly in the requirements, then the developer's not likely to go away and do these things, because they're
No.
told to kind of very often developers are told to deliver against what's been written down.
Yeah.
Again, there will be teams where developers are treated more like they're a partner in this kind of co-design or strategic
Hmm.
process, but I certainly still witness it being much more like a kind of
Yes.
factory, and the developer
Off
is
you go,
somewhat.
build
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And I think that's a really tricky process then to manage, isn't it? Like the expectations of, it just appearing and it being like, well, this isn't accessible. And
yeah,
we've also found the language around what accessible means to one person versus what it means to another person are two completely different things. And it's a balance of being like, okay, at the start, we all need to know what we mean by this word.
yeah,
So I think
yeah.
it's quite interesting.
Yeah, definitions are really important, absolutely.
Mm.
And closely related to the developers, maybe the delivery team thinks that the developers have all of that kind of attended to, or that's all sorted. There's a similar thing in the development community I've noticed as well, where again, I think it's this, we desire as humans for the simplest, least kind of stressful solution. So
Yeah.
often I think there's almost a level of mythology, or maybe even deluding, like developers kind of deluding each other. I'm not sure. It's probably more just myths within the industry that if you use X framework, then that's kind of all taken care of for you. So I think I've
Yeah.
heard developers saying that about, for example, Bootstrap, or even using the
Hmm.
government design system, which is much better. But there's this myth that if you use insert framework sort of toolkit here, then
Yeah.
that's all accessibility, and this horrible phrase of baked into it. But
Yeah.
that simply isn't true either. That there are always there's always potential for accessibility issues to creep in with any toolkit, basically,
Hmm.
which again comes back to why it's so critical to be doing testing, and
Yeah. And
ideally manual testing from a kind of technical perspective, but also user research from a human insights perspective as well.
yeah, definitely. Completely agree with that. And what do you think are the most exciting trends or insights that you've spotted on accessibility that you think are going to shape the future?
Yes.
Not a tricky question at all.
No. um, I think there's some interesting stuff happening with apps. So there's an app called Be My Eyes, which
Mm.
uh, initially it was a service where you would download it, and if you had low vision or no vision, you could use this app, and it would connect you with someone. I think it's a volunteer who would connect with you remotely, and they would sort of help you to complete tasks, whether that be within the home or out and about. Maybe it might be shopping or something.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was that you could have someone sort of help you to complete whatever task or goal it was in the day, and we, as part of that test and trace program that I mentioned, well, my colleagues in user research were kind of trialing how that might help with things like completing a lateral flow test. That's a bit of
Yeah,
a blast from the past hearing that phrase, isn't it? Or
it
like
really is. Yeah.
or like similar processes, basically, where perhaps there's like packaging that might be, slightly
Hmm.
difficult to open up, or just some details to that process of completing your own test. That I think the idea was that Be My Eyes could maybe partner up with
Yeah.
the test and trace teams, and that I remember thinking that was really fascinating. And since then, my understanding is that artificial intelligence has been integrated with the app. And that always makes me nervy when I hear that
Yes.
phrase.
Same.
I don't think I'm the only one, no. But I think this is an example of where it has been really thoughtfully implemented. It's not just
Hmm.
like chuck some AI magic dust onto this so we can kind of come up with a lovely PR exercise. It's genuinely a really good application of, I think, image processing and machine learning, I guess. I'm not an expert in these things. And what it has done is it's meant that the reliance on a volunteer has been diminished, as far as I'm aware.
Mm.
The idea now is that the individual using the app can use the camera to then identify objects within the space.
Brilliant.
So they can scan, for example, things, again, I believe this is correct, things in their fridge, for example, or clothes when they're shopping. And it will use, lots of technology, image recognition, and then come back with, this is oat milk. It costs this much, etc., etc. So for me, that
Fantastic.
is a really fascinating, exciting
Mm.
example of truly delivering against a real need and using
Yeah,
artificial
definitely.
intelligence in a sort of sensible way, basically. So that's really interesting. And then there's some cool stuff going on with tools as well. I think design tools, online whiteboards, there are
Hmm.
increasingly the teams involved in building those tools and improving them seem to be introducing accessibility features or removing barriers. So I know there's been quite big strides, for example, with Miro. I think
Hmm.
someone that I sort of know in the accessibility community might have helped Miro with some of their accessibility
Fantastic.
features, which is really cool.
Yeah.
And similarly, there are some really cool plugins, as which we touched on earlier, that you can bring into design tools.
Hmm.
That again, that are generally seem like they're built by teams that want to improve accessibility. So there's a team that I talk about this a lot as well. I bore people within the design community and the design team at Nomensa. There's a tool by the team at eBay for
Hmm.
Figma that's called Include, if I'm not mistaken, and that's really really clever. Simple tool that helps guides someone through the process of checking their design from an accessibility perspective, and you can kind of go step by step through using the tool to annotate or check the size of your buttons and links, and just the simple things that
Fantastic.
are within the guidelines, but that
Yeah.
without that kind of step-by-step help would be very difficult without training for
Yeah.
designer to know where to begin, basically. So, yeah.
Oh, brilliant. That massively helpful. I'll have to check those ones out. And I suppose an interesting one. What advice would you give to like young professionals, like wanting to get into the world of accessibility within design, like as a starting point? 'Cause it's not
That's
necessarily something that's completely covered on the curriculum all the time, or not on every course. So yeah, where
no,
would they
no.
start? Where would you say they start?
I think, I mean, I guess a good place to start is to, I think, just understanding the value of building a usable product. So I
Yeah.
might not even begin with accessibility necessarily. I think
Mm.
asking yourself, as someone working in design, what does it mean to be a good designer? I think would probably be
Yeah.
where to start.
That's
So
a really good point.
there's some great TED Talks out there on that topic,
Yeah.
which I sometimes go back to sort of inspire myself. But I think there might even be a documentary about Dieter Rams that I watched. So Dieter Rams being
Hmm.
um, um, the sort of head designer, I believe, for Braun in Germany. And he's a great example of someone who thought quite philosophically about what it means to do great design. I'm well aware he's by no means the only person to have thought philosophically about it, but I was particularly interested about Dieter Rams because of his influence on Johnny Ive, the lead designer for
Yes.
Apple as well. And when you look at, for example, at the calculator within the Apple iOS, and then you look at the physical
Yes.
calculator that Paul created, you can see there's definitely a big influence.
Yes, there definitely is influence.
So I think asking yourself what does it mean to be a good designer, and that does, I know that might sound a little bit fancy, but I think if at that point you start to think again, that my hope is that you start to think more about the sustainability. You know, Dieter Rams spoke a lot about the environmental impact, for example, or the impact of your design decisions. I think
Yeah.
that is the thing that God, I'm sounding really holier than thou, but really thinking about the impact of your design decisions. I think if beginning there, and I say maybe looking back into some of the past of the great designers that have been around, then I'd probably start to think about the accessibility aspects, you know, after having started with that kind of history of design, because it naturally leads on then to thinking, okay, yes, I've thought about the materials I'm using, or, you know, which tools I'm using and why, and what the impacts might be.
Yeah.
I mean, the ethical side of design is definitely quite a concern with, again, with artificial intelligence, and how easy it could be to introduce really awful biases, or, you know, horrendous ecological impacts from the things we're designing. The power in designers' hands has never been greater, really. So I think then it naturally leads on to thinking about who might I disadvantage if I did X or Y within my design. And I think that's where, you know, you can start to think about accessibility inclusion. But in terms of how you might start to learn about it, I guess, and on a more practical level, there's loads of stuff out there. I mean, that's there's so many materials and courses and things. So generally, when people ask where I might begin, the W3C, so the World Wide Web Consortium, has a course. I think it's produced by edX. There's like an introduction to accessibility, which covers both the kind of human elements to it. So there are stories and sort of vox pops introducing different disabilities and how people with disabilities may interact with your product or service. But it also does quite a good job of distilling down the sort of official guidelines and standards, which is, as you would imagine, that's kind of what you'd expect from a course that's by the W3C. And then there are a few different other online resources as well. There's one called there's a simple website called Alifant, if I remember correctly. So that's A11Y, I think PHANT, and that introduces you to the fundamentals of HTML and some of the simple coding considerations. And then there's thirdly, I think the other resource that I found useful, this would be probably more applicable to someone who has a background in development. There's also a course, an introduction to accessibility by Udacity as well.
Okay.
Those are a few resources.
That's
There
fantastic.
are loads. There are loads out there.
Oh, thank you, Joel. That's so helpful, I think, and just really insightful to hear your thoughts on everything. So really appreciate you sharing your expertise today. And I'm sure our audience have a really valuable takeaways from that. So if you'd like to connect with Joel, the best place to do that is on LinkedIn, Joel. Would that be the best place? Yeah, fantastic. I'll pop a link to your profile in the comments as well. So thank you to our audience for joining us. And if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to explore more on, just pop a note in the comment. Thank you then.